what drives Ahab's monomania in Herman Melville's Moby Dick. The word monomaniac has been used so often in reference to Ahab's character. We do not ask the deeper question, why? Blind vengeance? But even the blind interact in the visible world with purpose and alacrity. Might there be an underlying cohesive, motivating force to Ahab's all-consuming obsessiveness? Moby Dick's narrator, Ishmael, has many observations regarding Ahab, as do others in the book. But it is Ahab's final speech to his first mate, Starbuck, that is most revealing. It is a moment of rare vulnerability, where the epic, larger-than-life Captain Ahab reveals the depths of his tragedy. In a powerful image, representative of how metaphor often works in Moby Dick, we see the tear drop in the ocean. That is, the small specific image versus the illimitable vastness, the small and the mighty, the concrete and the vast. One man versus eternity, one ship versus fate, one life versus immortality. In chapter 132, near the end of the story, Ahab stands on the deck of his ship, the Pequod, and his first mate, Starbuck, witnesses a singular, poignant moment. From beneath his slouched hat, Ahab dropped a tear into the sea. Nor did all the Pacific contain such wealth as that one wee drop. What was the wealth in that wee drop? Just a few short chapters later, Ahab will confront the white whale directly, and in that final cataclysmic clash, both he and his entire crew will be dragged down to the ocean's abyss. Was it his blind irrational arrogance, his nihilistic rejection of all but his own obsession? Or was there something deeper, a tragic blend of pain and loss and a desperate yearning for what he has sacrificed? Here is the interaction between Starbuck and Ahab's speech. Starbuck saw the old man, saw him, how he heavily leaned over the side, and he seemed to hear in his own true heart the measureless sobbing that stole out of the center of the serenity around. Careful not to touch him or be noticed by him, he yet drew near to him and stood there. Ahab turned. "Starbuck." "Sir." "Oh, Starbuck, it is a mild wind, and a mild-looking sky. On such a day, very much such a sweetness as this, I struck my first whale. A boy harpooner of 18. 40 years ago. 40 years of continual whaling, 40 years of privation and peril and storm time. 40 years on the pitiless sea. For 40 years has Ahab forsaken the peaceful land, for 40 years to make war on the horrors of the deep. Aye, and yes, Starbuck, out of those 40 years I have not spent 3 ashore. When I think of this life I have led, the desolation of solitude it has been, the masoned, walled town of a captain's exclusiveness, which admits but small entrance to any sympathy from the green country without. Weariness, heaviness, Guinea Coast slavery of solitary command. When I think of all of this, only half suspected, not so keenly known to me before, and how for 40 years I have fed upon dry salted fare, fit emblem of the dry nourishment of my soil. When the poorest landsman has had fresh fruit to his daily hand, and broken the world's fresh bread to my mouldy crusts. Away, whole oceans away from that young girl wife I wedded past 50 and sailed for Cape Horn the next day, leaving but one dent on my marriage pillow. Wife. Rather a widow with her husband alive. I widowed that poor girl when I married her, Starbuck. And then the madness, the frenzy, the boiling blood and the smoking brow with which for 1,000 lowerings old Ahab has furiously, foamingly chased his prey, more a demon than a man. I, what a 40 years fool! Old fool, has old Ahab been. Why this strife of the chase? Why weary and palsy the arm at the oar and the iron and the lance? How the richer or better is Ahab now? Behold, O Starbuck, is it not hard that with this weary load I bear, one poor leg should have been snatched from under me? Here, brush this old hair aside. It blinds me that I seem to weep. Locks so grey did never grow but from out some ashes. But do I look very old? So very, very old, Starbuck? I feel deadly faint, bowed and humped as though I were Adam, staggering beneath the piled centuries since paradise. God, crack my heart, stave my brain. Mockery, bitter, biting mockery of grey hairs. Have I lived enough joy to wear ye, and seem and feel thus intolerably old? Close. Stand close to me, Starbuck. Let me look into a human eye. It is better than to gaze into sea or sky, better than to gaze upon God. By the green land, by the bright hearthstone. This is the magic glass, man. I see my wife and my child in thine eye. No, stay on board. Lower not when I do, when branded Ahab gives chase to Moby Dick. That hazard shall not be thine. No, not with the faraway home I see in that eye. This speech comes in chapter 132, called The Symphony. And a careful reading and rereading of this will reveal why. It is a symphony of images and meaning. We get philosophical meaning, psychological meaning, the images of the life that Ahab has and the life that he could have had. Immediately upon seeing Starbuck, Ahab goes into his speech talking about the mild wind that they are in and hearkening back to the first time he ever struck a whale. He was 18 years old. And we discover for the first time that Ahab, Captain Ahab, has been at continual work, at continual war, at continual toil for 40 years. We learn when he says, "I and yes, Starbuck, out of those 40 years, I have not spent 3 ashore. His life is one of duty to his work. It is a continual toil. It is the Protestant work ethic of always putting in all the work. But at what cost? What has he reaped for all this work? In all his 40 years, he has been the stoic captain. We learn, as leader, he has been completely alone, putting it all inside himself and only a stoic mask for the world to see. But in this one moment, we get a glimpse, a glimmer, a tiny singular teardrop in the illimitable ocean of Captain Ahab's soul. And we learn of the desolation of solitude, of the masoned walled town of a captain's exclusiveness, which admits but small entrance to any sympathy from the green country without. The people that he is feeding with the oil that lights their homes and that pushes forth their economy, they know nothing of poor Captain Ahab, toiling and fighting against the horrors of the deep. He has the self-awareness to know that his soil, or the dirt upon which a fruitful life can grow, is barren and dried out. He says, "I have fed upon dry salted fare, fit emblem of the dry nourishment of my soul. No joys can grow from this soil, no paradise from this toil." We get more revelations. Ahab did not marry until he was past 50. And in another heart-wrenching thought, of the 40 years at sea, he spent only a single night with a loving wife. As he says, leaving but one dent in my marriage pillow. After all this work, all this toil, the duty, the stoicism, Ahab questions his own purpose in life. His purpose was work and wailing and continual war. But for what? As he puts it, why weary and palsy the arm at the oar, and the iron and the lance? How the richer or better is Ahab now? What have I gotten out of all of this? He compares himself to Adam, the first man, the original progenitor of mankind, who was cast out of heaven for eating the apple from the forbidden tree of knowledge of good and evil, along with Eve. In doing so, he and Eve were punished with labor. Adam, the labor of working the land, and Eve, the labor of birth. So here, Ahab says, "I feel deadly faint, bowed and humped, as though I were Adam, staggering beneath the piled centuries since paradise." After all of this, Ahab, as though holding on to a buoy to life, holds on to Starbuck. He says, "Close, stand close to me, Starbuck. Let me look into a human eye. It is better than to gaze into sea or sky, better than to gaze upon God." This is the 19th century Romanticist credo. There is one thing grander than the sea, that is the sky. There is one thing grander than the sky, that is the interior of a human soul. What we see in this speech is not merely a recounting of a life of wailing, but the soul of a man who sacrificed every tender connection to the pursuit of a singular, all-consuming duty. Ultimately, Ahab's words invite us to consider the cost of unyielding dedication in our modern lives, where work and duty can sometimes overshadow personal joy. His tragic tale serves as a reminder. When we allow our responsibilities to consume us entirely, we risk losing touch with the very essence of being human. The imagery in this chapter, the Symphony, juxtaposes the immensity of the Pacific with the singularity of Ahab's tear. This contrast is emblematic of a broader theme in Moby Dick, the conflict between the vast, indifferent forces of nature and the intensely personal, emotional experiences of the individual. The ocean, endless and impersonal, contrasts sharply with the unique, irreplaceable value of a solitary tear, a drop that carries more meaning than the entire sea.